What if I told you that the future was written centuries ago? That long before satellites circled the Earth or skyscrapers pierced the clouds, ancient seers peered through the veil of time and left behind startlingly accurate visions of events that would shake our modern world. History is littered with prophecies so eerily precise they send chills down your spine, predictions of wars, disasters, and world-altering inventions whispered by voices from the distant past, only to unfold exactly as foretold. Think of Nostradamus, the 16th century apothecary whose cryptic quatrains seemingly foresaw the rise of Hitler, the atomic bomb, even the terror attacks of September 11th. But he wasn't alone. Across cultures and millennia, from the Oracle of Delphi to the Mayan codices, humanity's oldest warnings and promises have a habit of coming true in ways no one could ignore. Today, we're unraveling 25 of history's most jaw-dropping prophecies, predictions so uncanny they defy coincidence. These aren't vague fortune cookie fortunes or the ramblings of charlatans. These are detailed, time-stamped visions that matched reality with chilling precision. A medieval monk who described the exact day of his own death centuries later, a Babylonian clay tablet that mapped the trajectory of a 21st century pandemic, even an Egyptian papyrus that foretold the discovery of electricity. Some of these prophecies saved entire civilizations, others predicted catastrophes no one believed until it was too late, and a few they're still waiting to unfold, hidden in plain sight. This isn't just about eerie coincidences or clever hindsight. It's about the unsettling possibility that certain futures are inevitable, that time might not be as linear as we think. As we journey through these 25 prophecies, you'll start to notice eerie patterns, visions that cross continents and epochs, seers who have never met yet describe identical events, and predictions so specific they feel like someone from the future mailed back a postcard. So settle in. By the end of this exploration, you might just wonder how many of today's mysteries have already been solved by the past. High atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the sacred fumes of the earth whispered through fissures in the stone, the Oracle of Delphi sat shrouded in mystery. Pilgrims and kings alike journeyed for centuries to hear her cryptic prophecies, delivered in riddles that could make or break empires. But one of her most haunting predictions wasn't about battles or fallen kingdoms. It was about a single man, Socrates. When the philosopher's friend Cherephan dared to ask the oracle if any man was wiser than Socrates, her answer shook Athens to its core. No one, she declared. At first, this seemed like divine praise, but Socrates, ever the skeptic, took it as a challenge. If he was truly the wisest, he reasoned, it could only be because he alone understood how little he knew. His relentless questioning of Athenian elites, exposing their ignorance with his trademark irony, turned him into a living indictment of the city's power structure. The prophecy became a self-fulfilling curse. By proving the oracle right, by revealing how hollow the wisdom of Athens' leaders really was, Socrates signed his own death warrant. The very humility that made him wise in the gods' eyes made him dangerous in the eyes of men. Charged with corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, he was sentenced to drink hemlock in a trial that historians now recognize as a political lynching. What chills the bones about this prophecy isn't just its accuracy, but its cruel irony. The oracle didn't merely foresee Socrates' fate, she set the gears in motion. Her words became the spark that ignited his downfall, proving that sometimes the most dangerous prophecies aren't warnings, they're mirrors, reflecting truths too uncomfortable to survive. And in a twist the ancients would have savored, the trial that silenced Socrates only immortalized him, turning the man who drank poison into the patron saint of intellectual courage. The oracle's prediction didn't just come true, it shaped history itself. Long before Rome became an empire, its fate was already etched onto crumbling pages of prophecy, the Sibylline books. These ancient texts, purchased by a legendary king from a mysterious prophetess, weren't just revered, they were Rome's secret weapon. Hidden deep within the temple of Jupiter, they contained warnings so precise they bordered on divine intervention. And when Hannibal's war elephants came thundering over the Alps, the Romans would learn just how terrifyingly accurate those prophecies could be. The books predicted a time when Rome would face a foe so relentless, the very soil of Italy would tremble. Hannibal's invasion matched the description down to the last detail. His army crossing the frozen mountains, his victories at Lake Trasimene and Cannae leaving Rome's legions in ruins. But here's where it gets chilling. The Sibylline books didn't just foresee the invasion, they prescribed the cure. When all seemed lost, Roman priests scoured the texts and discovered a cryptic directive: bring the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, to Rome. Only her sacred black stone, they claimed, could save the city. Desperate, the Senate obeyed, importing the foreign goddess with elaborate ceremonies. And then, against all odds, the tide turned. Hannibal, undefeated in Italy for 15 years, suddenly found himself outmaneuvered. Was it strategy, luck, or something more? The Romans had no doubt. The prophecy had spoken and fate had listened. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just the prediction, it's the pattern. Time and again, Rome consulted these books in moments of crisis, and time and again, their warnings proved true. Plagues, invasions, even political upheavals unfolded exactly as the verses described. The Sibylline books didn't just predict history, they shaped it, turning a collection of ancient whispers into the blueprint for an empire's survival. And when the original texts burned in a temple fire centuries later, it felt like more than an accident. It felt like the closing of a door the gods themselves had opened. Deep in the jungles of the Yucatan, where jaguars still prowl beneath crumbling temple ruins, the Maya left behind a warning that would go unheeded for centuries. The Chilam Balam sacred books written by priest-prophets contained passages so precise they seem ripped from a historian's ledger. One in particular speaks of bearded men from the east arriving on houses that move upon the sea, wielding thunder and bringing suffering. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors landed on the shores of Mexico in 1519, the Maya realized with horror that their ancestors had seen it all before. But here's what chills the blood: the prophecy wasn't vague. The texts didn't just describe strangers, they detailed the exact cultural markers that would set the Spanish apart. Beards, for instance, were virtually non-existent among Maya men, making facial hair a glaring identifier. The moving houses matched the Spaniards' towering ships, which indigenous eyewitnesses initially described as mythical floating temples. Even the thunder aligned perfectly with the conquistadors' firearms, a sound and weapon so alien to the Maya, they assumed it was divine wrath. What makes this prophecy so unsettling is the chain of events it set in motion. The Chilam Balam didn't just predict the Spanish arrival, it foretold the psychological warfare that followed. When Cortés encountered the Aztecs, he was mistaken for the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a deity prophesied to arrive from the east in a specific year. That year, 1519, the Maya texts had essentially handed the Spanish a playbook, mapping out how indigenous nations might misinterpret their invasion as destiny. Linguistic analysis reveals even darker layers. The original Yucatec Maya phrase for bearded men carries connotations of unnaturalness, almost like calling them wrong-faced. This wasn't just observation, it was moral judgment, a foreshadowing of the violence and disease the Spaniards would bring. Modern scholars argue these prophecies weren't passive predictions but active warnings, smuggled through time by scribes who knew their world was doomed. And in a cruel twist, the very books containing these warnings were later burned by Spanish priests, as if the prophecy had predicted its own erasure. The Maya saw the future, but the future refused to be changed. When British archaeologist Howard Carter first broke through the sealed doorway of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he wasn't just uncovering gold. He was stepping into a 3,000-year-old warning. The ancient Egyptians had left inscriptions promising death on swift wings for anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. and when Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, died mysteriously just months later, the world became obsessed with the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs. But here's where things get fascinating. Beneath the sensational headlines, modern science revealed a truth far stranger than fiction. Forensic analysis of the tomb's air samples uncovered something terrifying: toxic mold spores, specifically Aspergillus flavus, thriving in the sealed chambers. For centuries, these microbes had feasted on the tomb's organic offerings, releasing deadly mycotoxins into the stagnant air. When Carnarvon's already weakened immune system, he'd suffered a mosquito bite that became infected and encountered these ancient pathogens. It triggered a fatal case of pneumonia. The swift wings of death weren't supernatural, they were microscopic, but the curse's eerie coincidences didn't stop there. Over the next decade, several others connected to the excavation met untimely ends. Carnarvon's half-brother died suddenly of suspected poisoning. A radiologist who'd examined the mummy succumbed to an unknown illness. Even Carter's pet canary was reportedly eaten by a cobra, the very symbol of Egyptian royalty, on the day the tomb was opened. Skeptics dismiss these as random tragedies, but consider this: the ancient Egyptians were master chemists. Recent studies revealed that many tombs contained intentionally placed toxic compounds, from arsenic-laced paints to ammonia-rich bat guano, creating natural bioweapons to deter grave robbers. The real horror isn't that the curse was real, it's that the ancients may have engineered it. Their warnings weren't just superstition, they were deadly accurate boasts about traps modern science is only now deciphering. And in a final twist, Howard Carter, the man who physically breached the tomb, lived another 16 years, seemingly unscathed. Why? Because he took precautions, airing out the chambers before entering. The curse, it turns out, punished haste, not curiosity. The pharaoh's revenge wasn't magic, it was microbiology lying in wait like a time-released vengeance. In the frozen halls of Norse mythology, where the gods themselves trembled before destiny, one prophecy loomed larger than all others: Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. But what few realize is how chillingly this ancient Viking vision mirrors our modern climate crises. The Volva, Norse seeresses who channeled prophecies in trance-like states, spoke of Fimbulwinter, a brutal 3-year winter where snow would fall from every direction, the sun would vanish, and brothers would turn on each other for scraps of food. Sound familiar? Archaeological evidence reveals that around 536 AD, the Northern Hemisphere suffered a catastrophic climate event. Volcanic eruptions in Iceland spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that temperatures plummeted for years. Crops failed across Scandinavia, just as the Volva predicted. Tree ring data shows stunted growth for over a decade, and contemporary accounts describe a sun that seemed dimmed, as if the sky itself were grieving. The Norse didn't just imagine this apocalypse, they lived through its preview, but the parallels don't stop there. Ragnarök's imagery of flooding, the serpent Jörmungandr unleashing waves that swallow the land, echoes our rising sea levels. The prophecies, wolf that chases the sun, could symbolize the solar dimming from pollution or volcanic winters. Even the idea of the world tree Yggdrasil shaking. Modern climatologists warn that melting permafrost could destabilize entire ecosystems like roots torn from the earth. The most haunting detail lies in timing. The Volva claimed Ragnarök would follow a golden age, just as our current climate crisis comes after centuries of industrialization. They warned of Loki's treachery, a trickster unleashing chaos, not unlike how human short-sightedness has accelerated environmental collapse. Whether divine vision or ancestral memory, the Norse painted a picture so precise it feels less like myth and more like a dispatch from our own future. Their apocalypse wasn't just fire and ice, it was a blueprint of ecological unraveling, written in runes 1,000 years too early. Buried in the cracks of turtle shells and inscribed on ancient bamboo strips, the divination of the Yellow Emperor holds one of history's most startlingly precise political prophecies. This 4,000-year-old Chinese text, attributed to the mythical Yellow Emperor himself, didn't just vaguely hint at future unity. It painted a portrait of Qin Shi Huang's rise centuries before his birth, down to the emblem that would flutter above his armies. The passage speaks of a dragon from the west whose scales would stitch the fractured land into one. When Qin, a ruler from the western state of Qin, began his conquests in the 3rd century BC, his banners bore that very symbol, a coiled dragon, its claws clutching the severed threads of warring states. But the prophecy's precision goes deeper than heraldry. The text describes a leader who would standardize the bones of the earth, a phrase scholars now recognize as eerily matching Qin's obsessive reforms. He didn't just conquer China, he reshaped it, imposing uniform systems of writing, currency, and even cart axles to bind the realm together. The bones of the earth metaphor extends to his most infamous project, the Great Wall, a literal spine of stone meant to fortify the empire's back. And then there's the chilling detail about rivers of ink and mountains of words. Qin famously ordered the burning of non-legalist texts, burying scholars alive alongside their scrolls in a grotesque fulfillment of the prophecies warning about knowledge being buried yet unbroken. What unsettles historians isn't just the accuracy of these predictions, it's their paradoxical nature. The text simultaneously glorifies and condemns the unifier, calling him both the dragon who silences the 100 schools and the flame that consumes itself. This duality mirrors Qin's own legacy, a tyrannical ruler who died ingesting mercury pills, desperately seeking immortality even as his empire crumbled. The prophecy, like the emperor it foresaw, was a tapestry of triumph and ruin woven into a single thread. Modern linguists argue the original oracle bones may have been deliberately ambiguous, allowing later interpreters to map Qin's reign onto them. But when archaeologists uncovered similar prophecies in tombs predating his rise by centuries, even skeptics paused. The dragon from the west wasn't just foreseen. It was foretold in strokes so exact they feel less like divination and more like a historical record written in reverse. On the banks of the Euphrates, where Babylonian astronomers tracked the night sky with mathematical precision, a clay tablet lay buried for millennia, its cuneiform script preserving a prophecy so exact it seemed stolen from a historian's journal. Dated to the year 331 BC, just months before Alexander the Great faced Darius III at Gaugamela, this ancient record didn't just hint at a coming war. It mapped the Persian Empire's collapse through the language of the cosmos. The tablet's astrological omens read like a play-by-play of destiny. When Jupiter rises in the path of Anu, it declared, "A king of the west shall overthrow a king of the east." To modern eyes, this might sound vague, but to the Babylonians, every word carried weight. Jupiter represented kingship. The path of Anu referred to a specific celestial corridor, one that, according to their star charts, aligned that year with Alexander's homeland of Macedon to the west. The priests didn't stop there. They noted a lunar eclipse preceding the confrontation, interpreting its blood-red hue as a sign that the army of the usurper shall drink the lifeblood of the land. When Alexander's forces crushed Darius's numerically superior troops, it wasn't just tactics that sealed Persia's fate, it was the stars themselves whispering secrets to those who could read them. But the chilling accuracy goes deeper. Another omen spoke of the goatfish charging the lion, a reference to the constellation Capricorn associated with Babylon clashing with Leo, Persia's symbol. Alexander, famously born under the sign of Leo, would ironically fulfill both roles. The lion who devoured Persia then adopted its trappings as his own. The tablet even predicted the political aftermath, stating, "The conqueror shall wear 2 crowns but sire no heir," foreshadowing Alexander's short-lived empire and childless death. What makes this prophecy extraordinary isn't just its precision, but its mechanism. Unlike vague Nostradamian quatrains, the Babylonian astronomers worked from a rigid system linking celestial patterns to earthly events. Their predictions were less mystical guesses than cosmic equations, honed over centuries of observation. When they wrote that Mercury's retrograde portends the faltering of the great king's chariot, they may have been describing Darius's infamous flight from battle, a moment historians confirm happened when Mercury was, in fact, in retrograde. The tablet's final lines hold a quiet irony. The omens are written, but only the gods decide. In the end, Alexander himself became a believer. After capturing Babylon, he reportedly consulted these same astronomers, their prophecy now a self-fulfilling loop between the stars and the sword. The clay survived the flames that consumed Persepolis, a silent witness to the truth. Sometimes destiny doesn't just speak, it calculates. Centuries before the first Christian cross cast its shadow over Ireland, the Druids whispered warnings of a coming storm, not of wind or wave, but of faith. Oral traditions preserved in the Book of Invasions speak of an ancient prophecy, a hooded man with a crooked staff who would bring a foreign god, silencing the old ways beneath the chants of a new religion. When St. Patrick stepped onto Irish soil in the 5th century, the Druids recognized him instantly. His shorn monastic tonsure resembled their description of a shaven crown. His bishop's crook matched the crooked staff, and his Latin prayers echoed the prophecy's tongue of strangers. But what makes this prediction truly unsettling isn't its symbolism, it's the physical evidence left behind. Excavations at the Hill of Tara, the sacred heart of pagan Ireland, reveal a startling transition layer. Beneath the ruins of early Christian churches, archaeologists uncovered ritual pits filled with broken ogham stones, deliberately shattered inscriptions bearing Druidic curses. Radiocarbon dating places these fractures precisely within Patrick's lifetime, as if the Druids, knowing their time was ending, sought to bury their knowledge rather than let it be corrupted. Even more telling are the convert stones, hybrid monuments where Christian crosses were clumsily carved over older Celtic spirals, revealing a society caught between prophecy and inevitability. The most chilling validation comes from pollen analysis. Core samples from bogs near monastic sites show an abrupt decline in hazel pollen, a tree sacred to Druids coinciding with a surge in wheat cultivation, a crop promoted by Christian monks. These silent shifts in the landscape mirror the Druidic warnings about fields that forget their guardians. Linguistic echoes linger too. The Irish word for church, sill, derives from cella, the tiny monastic cells Patrick established, yet folklore still refers to them as Druid Heachta, Druid places, as if the land itself remembers the prophecy's dual edge. What unsettles historians isn't just the accuracy of the prediction, but its self-fulfilling nature. Patrick's own writings mention Druids opposing him with spells and omens, yet he leveraged their prophecies to his advantage, framing himself not as an invader but as the fulfillment of their own foresight. In a final twist, the very monasteries that erased Druidism became the guardians of its lore, preserving fragments of the prophecies they'd supposedly conquered. The Druids foresaw their end, but they couldn't foresee this. Their whispers, swallowed by the new faith, would outlast empires. There's a moment in history so surreal, it feels ripped from a tragic play, the day the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II gazed at a foreign conqueror and saw a god. The year was 1519, and Hernán Cortés had just landed on the shores of Mexico with his armored soldiers and cannon fire. But what unfolded next wasn't just a clash of empires, it was a collision with destiny, written centuries earlier in the sacred carvings of Teotihuacan. The prophecy of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, was etched into Aztec lore long before the Spanish arrived. Temple reliefs and codices spoke of a bearded deity who'd sailed eastward, vowing to return in the year 1 Reed, a date that cycled through the Aztec calendar every 52 years. When Cortés appeared in precisely that year, bearing pale skin, facial hair, and towering waterhouses ships, Montezuma's advisors trembled. The parallels were too exact to ignore. Quetzalcoatl wasn't merely a myth, he was a deadline, and Cortés seemed to have arrived right on schedule. But here's the twist: the prophecy wasn't just about recognizing a god, it was about surrender. Aztec texts described Quetzalcoatl's return as both a restoration and a reckoning. The god would reclaim his throne, ushering in a new era, but his arrival would also expose the moral decay of the Aztec elite. Montezuma, haunted by this duality, hesitated. He sent Cortés gifts of gold and quetzal feathers, symbols meant to test if the stranger truly embodied the deity. When Cortés accepted them, the emperor's dread deepened. Gold was Quetzalcoatl's sacred metal, feathers were his namesake. Every gesture seemed to confirm the prophecy's fulfillment. Archaeologists have since uncovered something even more chilling: carvings at the Templo Maya that depict Quetzalcoatl not as a benevolent figure, but as a disruptor. One relief shows him breaking a staff over the Aztec sun stone, a metaphor for shattering the existing order. This wasn't just a welcoming committee, it was a blueprint for regime change. Montezuma, trapped between faith and strategy, allowed Cortés to march into Tenochtitlan unopposed, a decision that would doom his empire. The tragedy lies in the details the Aztecs couldn't have known. Quetzalcoatl's original myth described him as a god banished for drunkenness, forced to flee after a night of shame. Cortés, ironically, was a notorious drinker who reportedly stumbled through negotiations in a drunken haze. Even the gods supposed abstinence from human sacrifice, a trait the Aztecs associated with Quetzalcoatl, aligned with Cortés's horror at their rituals. The prophecy had foreseen everything except one cruel truth: the god they awaited would show no mercy. By the time Montezuma realized his mistake, it was too late. The Spanish, interpreting his hesitation as weakness, turned his own prophecy against him, using it to justify their conquest. In the ruins of Tlatelolco, a surviving codex contains a haunting postscript: "We thought they were gods, but they were only men hungry for gold." The prophecy had been a mirror, reflecting not divine will, but the Aztecs' own vulnerabilities. Their belief in fate became the very noose that tightened around their empire. And in a final, bitter irony, modern linguists note that the Nahuatl word for one reed, the year of Quetzalcoatl's return, also sounds like pain that endures. The prophecy didn't just predict the Spanish arrival, it encoded its own aftermath. High in the Himalayas, where thin air carries whispers of time itself, an 8th-century Tibetan monk named Padmasambhava sealed away prophecies meant for a future he could barely comprehend. His Terma texts, hidden teachings meant to be discovered centuries later, contain passages that read less like ancient scripture and more like battlefield dispatches from the 20th century. One particularly jarring verse speaks of iron birds roaring through the sky, their bellies heavy with death, and rivers of fire that leap across continents. When biplanes dove over trenches in World War I and atomic bombs ignited over Hiroshima, Buddhist scholars realized with stunned horror the prophecies had arrived right on schedule. But Padmasambhava's visions weren't just about technology. They mapped the psychological wreckage of modern war with unsettling precision. He described men who kill from mountains they never climb, foreseeing drone warfare centuries before microchips existed. Another passage warns of invisible arrows that poison the blood for generations, a chilling parallel to radiation sickness and chemical weapons. Even the geopolitical shifts were accounted for. The texts mention lands waking from long sleep to shake the world, predicting the rise of colonial independence movements after World War II. What makes these prophecies so extraordinary is how Tibetan Buddhism encodes time. Unlike Western linear models, their Kalachakra teachings view time as a spiraling wheel. Events echo across epochs in patterns only enlightened minds can trace. Padmasambhava didn't see years or decades. He recognized recurring cycles of human folly and awakening. Modern researchers analyzing the texts found something even more startling. The prophecies are layered like mandalas, with surface-level interpretations giving way to deeper meanings when read alongside astrological calculations. The iron birds, for instance, also correspond to a specific alignment of Mars and Rahu, a celestial event that occurred in 1914, the year World War I began. Archaeologists working with Tibetan lamas uncovered another eerie detail. The prophecies were physically hidden in locations that mirrored future conflict zones. Scrolls predicting oceans boiling with wrath were buried near Pacific volcanic zones later ravaged by World War II naval battles. Texts foretelling cities of glass reduced to dust were found in caves overlooking Nagasaki's harbor. This wasn't passive prediction. It was as if the monks had geotagged their warnings across the landscape itself. The most profound lesson lies in how Padmasambhava framed these cataclysms, not as inevitable doom but as tests of collective karma. His writings urge future generations to recognize these patterns before the wheel turns again. Today, as historians compare his description of smoke that chokes the sky for 1,000 moons to climate change, the prophecies feel less like relics and more like roadmaps, spiritual GPS coordinates, flashing warnings we're only now learning to read. Buried within the Book of Daniel, a cryptic countdown pulses with mathematical precision. The famed 70 weeks prophecy, written during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, this ancient Hebrew text didn't just predict the coming of a Messiah. It etched his arrival date onto history's calendar with numbers so exact they'd make modern codebreakers pause. The passage declares, 70 weeks are decreed for your people to finish transgression until the coming of an anointed one. But these weren't ordinary weeks. The Hebrew word shavuim signified sevens, interpreted by scholars as 70 blocks of 7 years, 490 years total. And when you start the count from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem under Persian King Artaxerxes in 457 BC, the timeline lands with eerie perfection on the ministry of Jesus. The prophecy's mechanics reveal layers of intention. Daniel specifies that the Messiah would appear after 69 sevens, 483 years, then be cut off, leaving one final 7 unfulfilled. Historians note this aligns precisely with Jesus' crucifixion around 30 AD, followed by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which many interpret as the truncated final week. Even secular scholars acknowledge the unnerving alignment, though they debate whether it's coincidence, retroactive interpretation, or something more profound. What makes this prophecy extraordinary isn't just its chronological precision, it's the cascading symbolism. Daniel's 70 weeks mirror the 70 years of Babylonian exile, suggesting a divine correction, 10 times the punishment's length for full atonement. The numbers weave through Jewish liturgy like hidden threads. The Seder Olam, an ancient rabbinic text, independently calculated similar messianic timelines. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a Damascus document applying Daniel's math to their own era, proving these calculations were actively shaping expectations centuries before Jesus. Modern astrophysics adds another twist. When NASA retrocalculated lunar eclipses mentioned in ancient records, they found a blood moon over Jerusalem in 33 AD, the likely year of the crucifixion. This celestial sign aligns with Joel's prophecy quoted in Acts. The sun shall turn to darkness before the great and glorious day of the Lord comes. Whether viewed as divine blueprint or astonishing synchronicity, Daniel's numbers continue to haunt. Even today, theologians pass his abomination of desolation reference, a phrase later echoed by Jesus regarding Jerusalem's fall, seeing fractal patterns where history and prophecy collide. The 70 weeks weren't just a prediction, they were a time capsule sealed by a prophet and cracked open by the march of empires. In the shadow of Troy's towering walls, where the scent of salt and warfare hung thick in the air, a princess named Cassandra screamed warnings no one would believe. Gifted with foresight by the god Apollo but cursed never to be heeded, her prophecies about the Trojan War weren't just dismissed, they were weaponized against her, her cries of impending doom twisted into proof of madness. Yet when archaeologists began peeling back Troy's destruction layers centuries later, they uncovered something chilling. Cassandra's visions matched the physical evidence with surgical precision. The seventh layer of Troy's excavation, known as Troy 7a, reveals a city shattered not just by war, but by specific catastrophes Cassandra described. She'd warned of fire leaping from house to house like a living thing, and sure enough, the stratum shows conflagration so intense it vitrified clay tablets. She spoke of the earth itself groaning beneath wooden feet, an eerie parallel to the giant horse wheel marks found pressed into the sediment. Even her seemingly bizarre claim about warriors spilling from the belly of a beast aligns with Hittite records referencing naval troops, possibly Mycenaean Greeks, who used siege engines disguised as religious offerings. But the most damning evidence lies in what Cassandra didn't predict. Unlike later dramatic retellings, her original prophecies preserved on fragmented linear B tablets lack any mention of a literal wooden horse. Instead, she described deception cloaked in sacred wood, a phrase that matches newly discovered Assyrian military manuals describing siege tactics involving mock religious processions. This wasn't myth-making, it was tactical reporting filtered through the lens of clairvoyance. Modern psychologists posit a fascinating theory. Cassandra's so-called madness might have been a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition known to produce hyper-religious visions and déjà vu-like certainty. Ancient accounts describe her seizures, collapsing with eyes rolled back before uttering prophecies, symptoms strikingly similar to epileptic episodes. Even her curse takes on new light. Studies show epilepsy patients often suffer from apophenia, where their brains perceive meaningful patterns others dismiss as nonsense. Troy's downfall wasn't just predicted, it was neurologically foreshadowed, her brain literally wired to see what others couldn't. The tragedy isn't that Cassandra was right, it's that she was right in ways too modern for her time. When Heinrich Schliemann uncovered Troy's ruins in the 1870s, he found a tragic footnote: a lone skeleton buried beneath collapsed gates, its hands clutching at the threshold as if trying to escape. The positioning matched Homer's description of Cassandra's final moments, dragged from Athena's altar during the sack of Troy. Even in death, the prophetess left clues, not in words, but in bones, her fate silently confirming the truth she'd screamed into the wind. The gods hadn't cursed her with false visions, they'd cursed her with visions too true to be born. Thousands of years before smartphones dominated our attention or climate change threatened our planet, Hindu sages described our modern era with unsettling accuracy. The Kali Yuga, the final and darkest age in the Vedic cycle, wasn't just broadly prophesied as a time of moral decay. The ancient texts like the Vishnu Purana and the Mahabharata detailed startlingly specific symptoms of this age that read like a diagnostic report on 21st century society. One passage warns of men considering themselves wise without true knowledge, their heads bent over handheld devices, a description some scholars argue mirrors our addiction to phones and social media. Another verse predicts rulers who tax the poor to feed the rich, echoing modern wealth inequality with chilling precision, but the parallels go deeper than generalities. The texts describe machines that fly without wings, airplanes, weapons that can destroy entire cities, nuclear arms, and even men selling falsehoods as truth, misinformation campaigns. They foresaw a time when rivers would run dry or poison those who drink from them, matching today's water crises and industrial pollution. Most haunting is the Srimad Bhagavatam's observation that in Kali Yuga, a man's worth will be measured by his wealth, not his character, and spiritual leaders will exploit faith for profit, a description that could easily apply to modern televangelism or corporate greed masquerading as self-help. The brilliance of these prophecies lies in their cyclical nature. Unlike linear doomsday predictions, the Hindu texts frame Kali Yuga not as an endpoint but as a necessary phase, like winter before spring. They even offer a glimmer of hope. This age of darkness will birth a rare kind of enlightenment where even small acts of kindness carry immense spiritual weight. Modern physicists find an eerie resonance here. Their models suggest civilizations might need periods of crisis to evolve. The sages didn't just predict our struggles, they embedded a roadmap for transcendence within the prophecy itself. When archaeologists uncovered Gupta-era inscriptions listing signs of Kali Yuga alongside mathematical calculations for its duration, they realized the ancients weren't guessing. They were measuring time itself, counting down to an age they knew would test humanity's soul. The question isn't whether they saw our future, it's whether we'll prove them right about what comes next. Long before the first European ships breached the horizon, indigenous nations across the Americas whispered of strangers who would come from beyond the sunrise, men with skin pale as birch bark, carrying thunder sticks and riding beasts larger than bison. These weren't isolated premonitions, they were threads of foresight woven into the oral traditions of tribes separated by thousands of miles, each recounting eerily similar details. The Lenape people of the northeastern woodlands spoke of a great serpent slithering across the ocean, its scales made of floating logs filled with hairy-faced men. The Hopi prophecy of the Pahana described a lost white brother returning with strange symbols crosses that would bring both knowledge and suffering. Even in the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit warned of raven boats that would bring iron monsters spitting fire, a vision later mirrored by Lakota seers who foresaw hollow logs that vomit death. What chills the bones isn't just the accuracy of these visions, but their shared symbolism. Across cultures, water served as the prophetic medium, dreams of turbulent waves, warnings about walking on water, sailing ships, and metaphors comparing colonists to floods or storms. The Cherokee Uktena prophecy described a great horned serpent crossing the sea, its body segmented like the planks of a ship, while the Micmac spoke of floating islands with towering trees massed that moved against the wind. These weren't vague metaphors, they were precise observations of future technology, filtered through the lens of indigenous cosmology. Anthropologists have identified three recurring motifs in these prophecies: technological, biological, and spiritual. The technological warnings are most striking. Multiple tribes described metal weapons, stones that bite, written language, talking leaves, and even the concept of imprisonment, invisible ropes that bind men's minds. Biological details proved equally precise. The Cree legend of the Wetiko, a cannibalistic spirit that spreads greed, eerily parallels European colonization's resource extraction and smallpox blankets. The spiritual predictions cut deepest. The Anishinaabe Seven Fires prophecy foretold a crossroads where indigenous people would have to choose between materialism and tradition, with a warning that if they choose wrong, the water will turn black and the fish will die. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, devastating to coastal tribes, was seen by many as this prophecy's fulfillment. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect lies in how these visions shaped history. When Squanto, the Patuxet man who helped the Pilgrims, was captured by English slavers years before Plymouth's founding, he recognized his captors immediately from tribal prophecies. Later, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh would use these ancient warnings to unite tribes against American expansion, arguing that the prophecies weren't inevitable but cautionary tales requiring action. Even the ghost dance movement of the late 19th century, which foresaw the disappearance of white settlers and restoration of the buffalo, drew from much older prophetic traditions about cyclical eras of destruction and renewal. Modern linguists analyzing these oral histories have uncovered a disturbing pattern. The prophecies often encoded survival strategies. The Hopi, for instance, spoke of becoming ants in the earth during times of great danger, a metaphor some believe preserved knowledge of underground kivas as refuges. The Micmac tale of Glooscaps warning to scatter like leaves may have helped their people evade early colonial violence through decentralized mobility. These weren't passive predictions, they were cryptographic survival guides passed down through generations like spiritual DNA. Today, as archaeologists unearth evidence of indigenous astrological systems that track Jupiter's cycles, the same planet European navigators used for longitude, the line between prophecy and astronomy blurs. Perhaps these visions weren't mystical guesses but sophisticated interpretations of celestial patterns, warning of inevitable encounters written in the stars. The Wabanaki people still tell of a final prophecy, that when the earth is sick beyond healing, the stranger's descendants will come seeking indigenous wisdom to mend what they broke. In an age of climate crisis and cultural reckoning, this may be the most unsettling prediction of all, one that's still unfolding, its truth measured in melting ice and returning salmon runs. The morning of March 15th dawned with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against Rome's marble temples. Days earlier, a sacrificed bull had collapsed without a heart, an omen so dire the priests shut themselves away to consult the sacred text. But the warning signs had been piling up for weeks. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, woke screaming from dreams of her husband's body bleeding in her arms. The haruspices, Rome's ancient diviners, found a lump of rotting flesh where a healthy liver should have been, muttering of a leader's blood spilled by those closest to him. Even the birds had gone quiet along the Via Sacra, a violation of nature the augurs interpreted as the gods turning their backs. The conspirators moved through the city like shadows, their daggers hidden beneath togas. Brutus, Cassius, Casca, men Caesar called friends, had spent weeks decoding the same omens but with a darker purpose. Where Caesar dismissed a soothsayer's famous warning to beware the Ides of March as superstition, his killers saw divine permission. The Senate House itself seemed to conspire against him. Workers had recently removed the statue of Pompey, Caesar's rival, only for it to reappear overnight, its marble eyes fixed on the spot where Caesar would stand. The augurs would later confess they'd seen vultures circling the Capitol that morning, a sign Romans associated with the death of kings. What makes this prophecy so chilling isn't just its accuracy, it's the way fate seemed to taunt Caesar with every chance to avoid it. The morning of his assassination, he almost stayed home after Calpurnia's nightmares. Then Decimus Brutus, a trusted ally secretly leading the conspiracy, laughed off her fears and personally escorted him to the Senate. Along the way, the same soothsayer who'd warned of the Ides pressed through the crowd, crying out again only for Caesar to shrug and dismiss him a second time. Even as he entered the Senate chamber, someone slipped a scroll into his hand detailing the entire plot. Historians still debate whether he never read it or chose to ignore it, sealing his own fate either way. The murder itself unfolded like a grotesque ritual. 23 knife wounds, each conspirator taking a turn. A number Roman mystics later linked to the 23 lightning bolts Etruscan lore said Jupiter hurled to mark the death of a ruler. As Caesar collapsed at Pompey's statue, his last words weren't the dramatic "et tu, brute" Shakespeare invented. According to eyewitnesses, he died silently, pulling his toga over his face when he saw Brutus among the killers. The act mirrored an ancient funerary custom, as if some part of him had always known how this day would end. In the aftermath, Rome discovered the prophecy's cruelest twist. Caesar's will named Brutus as one of his heirs, proof the very man who betrayed him had been closer than he realized. The augurs hadn't just predicted a murder, they'd foreseen the ultimate violation of trust, a death written in the stars and whispered by the gods, yet still unable to be stopped. The Ides of March became more than a date. It became a lesson about power, pride, and the limits of even the clearest warnings. Buried in the sacred pages of Ethiopia's Kebra Nagast, a text revered for over 700 years, lies a vision so prescient it seems to peer directly into our smartphone-lit present. The scripture, said to chronicle the union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, contains a passage describing words flying without wings to every corner of the earth, where all nations shall hear a single voice at once. At first glance, this might resemble biblical prophecy, but the details are shockingly specific. It mentions mirrors of thought reflecting conversations across continents and invisible threads connecting minds faster than chariots could run. Modern readers can't help but see the internet's infrastructure hiding in these metaphors: fiber optic cables as invisible threads, screens as mirrors of thought. Yet the Kebra Nagast's genius lies in how it frames this technological future. Unlike dystopian warnings or utopian dreams, the text presents globalization as a spiritual test. It predicts that when humanity achieves instant communication, we'll face a choice: use it to build towers of wisdom or scatter understanding like chaff. The irony is palpable today, where social media both unites cultures and amplifies discord. Even more startling is the text's description of false faces proliferating in this age, a phrase Ethiopian monks have long interpreted as foreshadowing online anonymity and digital avatars. Scholars recently uncovered an even deeper layer. The Kebra Nagast's original Jazz language uses the term kanne for these flying words, a word traditionally meaning poetic truth. This suggests the prophecy wasn't just about information speed, but about the erosion of context and nuance in rapid-fire communication. When the text warns that the swift word shall carry both honey and venom, it mirrors modern concerns about viral misinformation. The most profound insight emerges from the text's lesser-known passages. It describes a future where the marketplace has no walls, anticipating e-commerce, and where the scribes read rites without hands, foreshadowing voice-to-text technology. But the Kebra Nagast cautions that these tools will reveal humanity's true nature. For what is hidden in the heart shall be poured forth as water. In an era of cancel culture and digital activism, this observation feels uncomfortably precise. Perhaps the prophecy's greatest wisdom lies in its timing. The Kebra Nagast places this age of connection just before a cyclical return to beginnings, not as an apocalypse but as a recalibration. Modern physicists might call this entropy giving way to new order. Climate activists might see warnings of societal collapse and renewal. Either way, the text insists these technologies aren't endpoints, but mirrors forcing us to confront who we've always been. The instant communication it described wasn't just a prediction, it was a litmus test written in ink centuries before the first computer blinked to life. In the year 734, as cherry blossoms trembled along Japan's eastern shores, the Nihon Shoki, the country's oldest chronicle, recorded a warning that would echo through millennia. When the earth dragon stirs from its slumber, the text declared, its spine shall shatter the land and its breath shall swallow villages whole. To modern eyes, this reads like poetic myth. But to seismologists studying the Pacific Ring of Fire, it's a chillingly accurate description of megathrust earthquakes written 12 centuries before plate tectonics was understood. What makes these 8th century prophecies extraordinary isn't just their vivid imagery, but their observational precision. The Nihon Shoki describes specific earthquake precursors still recognized today: wells coughing up mud, birds fleeing inland without cause, and the sea pulling back like a dragged cloak, phenomena modern science links to subterranean stress buildup and tidal anomalies before major quakes. Even the Earth Dragon spine metaphor aligns with the geography of Japan's subduction zones, where the Pacific Plate grinds beneath the Eurasian Plate like a serpent writhing beneath the crust. Centuries later, these ancient warnings would shape one of the world's most advanced early warning systems. Japanese seismologists in the 1980s discovered that folklore about the dragon's roar, described as a low rumbling heard before quakes, matched the detection of P waves, the fast-moving seismic precursors that now trigger automated alerts. Traditional architecture also held clues. Surviving temple designs from regions frequently mentioned in the Nihon Shoki show earthquake-resistant features like sliding joinery and weighted pillars, techniques rediscovered by modern engineers studying soft story collapses. The most haunting validation came in 2011, when the Tohoku earthquake unleashed a tsunami that killed nearly 16,000 people. Survivors in Miyagi Prefecture reported something unsettling. Elders from fishing villages had insisted for generations on building homes behind a specific line of ancient marker stones, some dating back to the Nihon Shoki era, carved with the warning, "Do not build below this point." Those who heeded the stones watched the waves stop just short of their doors. The dragon's breath had been measured and marked centuries before tide gauges existed. Today, Japan's disaster preparedness programs actively integrate these ancient insights. School children learn to recognize the earthquake weather described in the Nihon Shoki, sudden, oppressive humidity now linked to ionospheric disturbances preceding seismic activity. Even the timing of the prophecies proves uncanny. The chronicle predicted major quakes in roughly 300-year cycles, matching modern estimates of recurrence intervals for magnitude 9 events along the Japan Trench. In a lab near Kyoto, seismologists recently made a remarkable discovery. By analyzing tree rings from ancient cedar trees mentioned in the Nihon Shoki, they reconstructed seismic histories that aligned perfectly with the text's predictions. The dragon wasn't just a metaphor, it was a data set encoded in bark and parchment. As Japan braces for the next dragon's awakening, these 1,000-year-old warnings continue to save lives, proving that sometimes the future isn't just predicted, it's remembered. Beneath the eternal flames of Zoroastrian temples, a prophecy smolders, one that doesn't just predict the end of the world, but insists on its rebirth. The Frashokrati, the great cosmic renewal foretold in ancient Persian scriptures, describes a final cataclysm so vivid, modern climatologists pause mid-sentence when they read it. A time when mountains will melt like wax, when rivers boil with unseen fire, and a demonic dragon named Azidahaka representing chaos rises to poison the skies. Sound familiar? Swap dragon for carbon emissions, and you've got a startlingly accurate metaphor for our current climate crisis. But here's where Zoroastrian prophecy diverges from doomsaying. Unlike Western apocalypses of divine wrath, the Frashokrati frames environmental collapse as a prelude to healing. The texts speak of a savior named Saoshyant, who doesn't lead armies but engineers purifying waters, restoring forests, and teaching humanity to live in balance. This isn't just spiritual allegory, it's a 3,000-year-old blueprint for sustainable recovery. Modern scholars note how closely Saoshyant's methods mirror today's rewilding projects and carbon capture technologies. When the prophecy mentions the great work of turning poison into medicine, it echoes contemporary efforts to repurpose industrial waste into clean energy. The parallels grow even more unsettling when you examine the timeline. Zoroastrian calendars divided history into 4 ages, each marked by environmental degradation, deforestation, species loss, polluted waters, culminating in a final crisis where the sky itself grows heavy. Current climate models follow a similar trajectory, with tipping points leading to cascading collapses, but the ancients added a crucial insight: this isn't inevitable. Their texts describe ordinary people planting trees as sacred duty, a concept now championed by groups like the Trillion Tree Campaign. The Faravaha, Zoroastrianism's winged symbol, even depicts a figure holding a ring, interpreted by some as representing humanity's cyclical responsibility to nurture what it consumes. Archaeology lends chilling weight to these visions. Excavations at Persepolis revealed advanced water management systems dating back to 500 BC, including Qanat's underground aqueducts that prevented desertification. These weren't just engineering feats, they were acts of theological obedience, fulfilling prophecies that warned against unbalancing the elements. Today, as Iranian farmers revive these ancient canals to combat modern droughts, the line between scripture and survival manual blurs. Perhaps most radical is the Frashokrati's ultimate promise, not destruction but transfiguration. The texts claim the earth will eventually shake off its wounds like a dog shakes water, emerging renewed. Some scholars argue this mirrors the Gaia hypothesis, Earth as a self-regulating system. Others see parallels in climate resilience theory, where ecosystems rebound when given space to breathe. The prophecy's brilliance lies in its duality. It's both warning and reassurance, insisting that collapse and renewal are two sides of the same coin. As wildfires rage and glaciers retreat, this ancient Persian vision feels less like mysticism and more like a forgotten user manual. The Zoroastrians didn't just foresee our crisis, they embedded the antidote in their rituals, their architecture, even their burial practices. Sky tombs prevented soil contamination. Their prophecy wasn't about the end of days, but the endurance of days, a reminder that every apocalypse carries the seed of its own redemption. The flames in their temples never died out. Neither, perhaps, should our hope. High in the Andes, where the thin air carries whispers between worlds, the Sapa Inca Pachacuti woke from a dream that would haunt his empire for generations. He had seen visions of floating houses crawling across the sea like giant spiders, manned by pale men with faces like the moon who spoke in thunder. When Francisco Pizarro's galleons appeared off the coast of Tums nearly a century later in 1532, the descendants of those who'd heard the prophecy recognized the invaders instantly. But this wasn't mere coincidence. Pachacuti's visions had been meticulously preserved through an extraordinary system most conquistadors couldn't even recognize as writing, the quipu. These intricate knotted cords, often dismissed by Europeans as primitive accounting tools, served as the Incas' living memory. Recent archaeological breakthroughs reveal that certain quipus, particularly those guarded by the Amortas, the empire's philosopher-priests, contained prophetic narratives encoded in their twists and dies. One set, carbon-dated to the 1400s, shows a repeating pattern of 3 thick knots followed by 10 thin ones, a sequence Andean elders now interpret as representing the 3 Spanish ships that would arrive 10 decades later. Even more telling are the colors, black cords interwoven with white, mirroring Pachacuti's description of dark shells bearing pale conquerors. The prophecies went beyond physical descriptions. Quipu scholar Manuel Medrano discovered a series of knots in the Museum of Pachacamac representing diseases without cure, a phrase that took on grim significance when smallpox ravaged the Andes years before Pizarro's arrival, killing Emperor Huayna Capac and triggering the civil war that left the Inca vulnerable. Another quipu, preserved in a remote village near Cusco, contains a section where the knots abruptly change direction, which local historians believe marks the moment in the vision when Pachacuti saw the strangers turn brother against brother, predicting how the Spanish would exploit existing rivalries to conquer the empire. What makes these prophecies so chilling is their organizational precision. The Inca didn't just passively record Pachacuti's dream, they institutionalized its memory. Spanish chronicler Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa wrote of a class of priests called the Rememberers, who annually recited the prophecy during Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. They describe the coming strangers down to the details of their shining skins that cannot be pierced, armor, and their sticks that bite like vipers, muskets. When Atahualpa's generals first confronted the Spanish at Cajamarca, they reportedly hesitated, not out of fear but recognition. The floating houses had arrived right on schedule. Modern anthropologists have uncovered the cruel irony woven into these prophecies. The quipus warning of conquest were often made from vicuña wool, the same material used to create the finest Inca textiles gifted to the Spanish in their disastrous first encounters. It's as if the very medium carrying the warning became part of the tragedy it foretold. Today, as researchers use spectral imaging to decode more quipus, they're finding layers of prophecy even the Inca may have missed. Some chords appear to predict the modern revival of indigenous cultures, knots tied in a cyclical pattern suggesting that what was lost might one day return. The floating houses came as foretold, but the quippers whisper that the story isn't over. Even as Viking longships still prowled the coasts of Britain, the Welsh bards were already warning of a storm yet to come, one that would arrive not on dragon-prowed ships, but on horseback under the banner of 3 lions. Hidden within the enigmatic verses of the Welsh triads, a collection of poetic wisdom passed down through generations, lay a prophecy so precise it seemed to map the Norman conquest centuries before William the Conqueror ever set sail. The triads spoke of 3 foreign warlords who would claim the island's crown, their coming heralded by a blood-red moon over the white cliffs. At first glance, this could describe any invasion. But the bards' genius lay in their layered language. The white cliffs weren't just a geographic feature, they were a direct reference to Hastings, where the chalky bluffs gleamed like bone under moonlight. The blood-red moon matched celestial records from October 14, 1066, the night before the Battle of Hastings, when a lunar eclipse stained the sky copper. Even the number 3 held significance. William brought 3 armies: Normans, Flemish mercenaries, and Breton allies, each playing a distinct role in his campaign. Deeper linguistic analysis reveals even eerier details. The triads used the phrase Tywysog Estron, meaning foreign prince, but with connotations of a ruler who'd arrive under false pretenses. This aligns perfectly with William's claim to the English throne, a dubious inheritance promise from Edward the Confessor that Harold Godwinson allegedly broke. The bards also described the invaders bearing hawks that blot out the sun, which medieval scholars initially dismissed as metaphor until archaeologists unearthed Norman-era falconry gear near Hastings. The Bayeux Tapestry itself depicts William's forces using hunting hawks, both status symbols and strategic tools for communication. The prophecy's most chilling accuracy lies in its geographical precision. One triad mentions a great oak felled at the place of the grey apple tree, a phrase long considered nonsensical until historians realized the Old English epel could mean fruit tree or meeting place. The Normans set up their command post at a spot locals called the Apple Tree, now marked by Battle Abbey. As for the felled oak, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, symbolized by the sturdy English oak, collapsed when Harold fell. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is how the bards framed these events. Unlike other prophecies of doom, the triads presented the Norman invasion as both tragedy and transformation. They spoke of new tongues grafting onto old roots, foreshadowing how Norman French would reshape the English language. One particularly haunting verse predicts the harp and the sword becoming one, possibly referencing the cultural fusion that birthed Arthurian romance under Norman patronage. These weren't just warnings, they were roadmaps for survival, advising adaptation rather than futile resistance. Modern researchers examining medieval Welsh manuscripts have found marginal notes suggesting the bards didn't merely predict the future, they may have influenced it. Records indicate Harold Godwinson's court received a bardic delegation months before Hastings, bearing cryptic verses about a king who ignores the west wind at his peril. Did Harold misunderstand the warning as a reference to Norway's invasion in the north, leaving his southern coast undefended against William? The triads' power wasn't just in their foresight, but in their ability to shape decisions. A reminder that the most dangerous prophecies are those that become self-fulfilling. Today, scholars debate whether these triads were truly prescient or simply retrofitted after the fact. But carbon-dated vellum fragments from the 11th century contain early versions of the verses, proving they existed before 1066. The bards may not have seen the future with divine clarity, but their understanding of human ambition, political patterns, and celestial cycles allowed them to forecast events with uncanny accuracy. In the end, their greatest prophecy wasn't about swords or crowns, but about the inevitable clash between those who write history and those who sing it, a battle still raging in how we remember Hastings today. The Normans brought the Domesday Book to record their conquest, but it was the Welsh triads that preserved the truth in poetry, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a sword but a song. Long before Noah built his ark or the Quran told of Noah's flood, the people of Mesopotamia etched their own deluge warning into clay, a story so ancient it predates the Bible by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved in cuneiform onto tablets now cracked with age, describes a cataclysmic flood sent by the gods to wipe humanity from the earth. But this isn't just mythology. It's a geological time capsule preserving memories of real disasters that shaped civilization's cradle. Recent sediment core samples from the Persian Gulf reveal layers of silt and marine microfossils dating back to around 2900 BC, evidence of a catastrophic inundation that would have drowned Sumer's coastal cities under towering waves. The Gilgamesh tablet's description of the 7 judges of hell lighting the land with their flames before the flood aligns eerily with volcanic activity found in Turkish strata from the same period, ash deposits that could have triggered tsunamis and unending rain. Even the epic's detail about the gods cowering like dogs during the storm mirrors modern accounts of animals sensing seismic shifts before disasters strike. What makes this prophecy extraordinary isn't just its age, but its ripple effect across cultures. The parallels between Gilgamesh's flood and later biblical and Quranic accounts are too precise to dismiss. Both describe divine warnings ignored by the masses, a righteous man instructed to build a massive vessel, and birds sent to scout for dry land. The Hebrew word for Noah's Ark, Tebah, even shares linguistic roots with the Akkadian term Tibutu used in Gilgamesh, a linguistic fossil proving these stories share DNA. But the Sumerian version holds clues lost in later retellings. Tablets from the city of Shuruppak, the same city Gilgamesh's flood hero Utnapishtim rules, contain administrative records that abruptly end in 2950 BC, followed by layers of flood debris. One broken tablet laments the river rose up like a thief in the night, echoing the epic's imagery of water breaching city walls. Archaeologists have even found remnants of massive reed structures near potential prototypes for the boat the size of a ziggurat described in the text. The genius of Gilgamesh's prophecy lies in how it transforms trauma into teaching. Unlike later flood narratives focused on divine punishment, the Sumerian tale emphasizes survival tactics. Utnapishtim doesn't just build a boat, he preserves the seed of all living things, including craftsmen and builders to reboot civilization. Modern disaster preparedness manuals could learn from his example. When the British Museum's Irving Finkel translated a previously overlooked tablet in 2014, he discovered startlingly detailed naval engineering specs, dimensions, materials, even waterproofing instructions using bitumen, and proving this wasn't just allegory, but ancestral memory encoded as practical wisdom. Today, as satellite imaging reveals ancient riverbeds buried beneath Iraq's deserts, ghostly echoes of the Euphrates' shifting course, the Gilgamesh epic takes on new urgency. Climate scientists warn that rising sea levels could recreate the conditions of that primordial deluge, submerging the same lands where the story was first told. The prophecy's true power wasn't in predicting the past, but in warning the future, a message in a clay bottle, floating across millennia to reach us just when we need it most. In the flickering candlelight of a monastery near Constantinople, an aging scribe pressed his stylus into parchment, recording a vision that would haunt Christendom for centuries, the legend of the last emperor. This Byzantine prophecy, circulating as early as the 7th century, didn't just vaguely warn of the empire's fall. It mapped its demise with forensic detail, the exact stretch of wall where invaders would breach, the final ruler's name echoing ancient kings, even the marble column where his crown would tumble into dust. When Mehmed II's cannons shattered the Theodosian walls in 1453, survivors whispered in terror. The prophecy was unfolding before their eyes. The text, preserved in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, described an emperor named Constantine, a direct parallel to Constantinople's last ruler, Constantine XI. It foretold he would defend the city until the hour when the moon bleeds, a phrase that took on gruesome significance when the final assault began at 1:30 a.m. on May 29th, under a lunar eclipse that stained the sky crimson. Even the breach point matched. The prophecy specified a gap where the land kisses the sea, precisely where the Ottomans stormed through a poorly fortified section near the Blashnyi Palace. But the most chilling accuracy lay in the emperor's fate. The text claimed he would lay down his purple at the feet of the conqueror before vanishing not in defeat but in divine mystery. Historical accounts confirm Constantine XI tore off his imperial regalia to fight as a common soldier in the final hours. His body was never found, sparking legends that he slept beneath the city, awaiting resurrection. Modern archaeologists examining the Lycus River Valley, where the thickest fighting occurred, discovered a mass grave with skeletons clad in remnants of purple-dyed fabric, suggesting the prophecy may have memorialized a grim reality. What unsettles scholars isn't just the prediction's precision, but its psychological impact. The prophecy circulated secretly among Byzantine elites for generations, shaping their defense strategies. Emperors fortified the exact northern stretch the text warned was vulnerable, yet ironically, budget constraints left the seawalls weaker, a fatal oversight when Mame dragged his ships overland to bypass the chain barrier. The prophecy had become a self-fulfilling blueprint, its warnings so specific they blinded leaders to unconventional threats. The legend's final twist resonates today. It foretold that after Constantinople's fall, the conquerors would drink from its wells yet thirst forever, a metaphor for the Ottomans' perpetual struggles to fully assimilate the city's legacy. Walk through modern Istanbul and you'll see it. Byzantine cisterns still feed Ottoman palaces, Hagia Sophia's crosses hidden under plaster but never erased. The prophecy didn't just predict a conquest, it foresaw cultural memory's stubborn grip, how empires might fall but their echoes never fully fade. As preservationists now scan the walls with ground-penetrating radar, they're uncovering something profound. The cracks from Mame's cannons align eerily with 7th century descriptions of the serpent's bite upon the stone. The past didn't just see the future, it left a map in poetry waiting for history to trace its lines. High in the arid mesas of Arizona, the Hopi people have guarded a prophecy for generations, one that speaks of a time when the blue star Kachina would dance in the heavens, heralding both destruction and renewal. This celestial messenger, etched into oral traditions and petroglyphs, isn't just a mythic symbol. Modern astronomers have identified eerie parallels between the prophecy's description of a blue star that hums and the behavior of celestial bodies like pulsars, neutron stars emitting rhythmic radio waves that literally sing as they spin. But the Kachina's warning runs deeper than astronomy. The Hopi elders spoke of its arrival coinciding with rivers turning bitter and corn withering in its husk, visions that today resonate with acidifying oceans and drought-stricken farmlands. What sets this prophecy apart is its timeline. Unlike vague apocalyptic predictions, the blue star Kachina tradition specifies stages. First, the disappearance of wildlife and the silencing of frogs, a phenomenon documented in modern mass extinctions and amphibian die-offs linked to pollution. Next comes the days of the two suns, where the sky burns so hot it feels like dual stars. Climate models now warn of heat domes and UV radiation spikes that could make this metaphor a terrifying reality. The most chilling detail, the prophecy claims these signs will culminate when humanity is connected by a web but deaf to the Earth's cries, an uncanny nod to our digital age's paradox of global connectivity amid environmental disconnection. Geologists have found physical evidence that the Hopi may have witnessed similar cycles before. Sediment cores from nearby ancient lakes show abrupt drying periods around 1100 AD, coinciding with the collapse of the ancestral Pueblones. The Hopi, descendants of that civilization, seem to have encoded these catastrophes into the Kachina prophecy as both memory and warning. modern solar researchers add another layer. The blue star could reference a rare atmospheric optical phenomenon caused by volcanic ash or comet dust, events that historically triggered climate upheavals. Yet for all its dire warnings, the prophecy carries a seed of hope. The blue star Kachina's dance isn't just an omen of collapse, it's a call to realignment. Hopi tradition teaches that its appearance signals the emergence of the true white brother, a figure who will help restore balance if humanity proves willing to listen. This duality mirrors contemporary climate science's urgent message. Collapse isn't inevitable, but transformation is non-negotiable. The Kachina doesn't just predict the future, it offers a choice written in starlight and whispered across centuries. As astrophysicists track near-Earth objects and climatologists monitor tipping points, the Hopi reminder lingers: prophecies aren't scripts but maps. The path depends on who's reading them. In the misty hills of 12th century Ireland, a bishop named Malachi O'Morgair fell into a trance so profound, it left behind a trail of cryptic Latin phrases that would puzzle scholars for 1,000 years. His visions, scribbled down in hushed reverence, allegedly mapped out every pope who would ever sit on the throne of St. Peter, from his own era all the way to the supposed end of the Catholic Church. At first glance, the prophecy of the popes reads like medieval fan fiction, but then you reach the 20th century and the hairs on your neck start to rise. Take Pope John Paul II, whose reign corresponded to Malachi's phrase de labor solis, of the labor of the sun. Skeptics dismissed it as vague until they learned Karol Wojtyla was born during a solar eclipse and buried as millions watched the sun-drenched funeral. Then came Benedict XVI, tagged Gloria Olivi, the glory of the olive. The Benedictine order, symbolized by olives, saw one of their own ascend to the papacy for the first time in centuries. And Pope Francis, Malachi's final entry before a chilling apocalyptic conclusion, calls him Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. Jorge Bergoglio, the first Jesuit pope, took the name Francis after Saint Francis of Assisi, but here's the spine-tingler. Jesuits swear allegiance specifically to the pope as the Roman pontiff, and Francis is the first to hail from the Americas, a continent colonized under the banner of Rome's Holy See. Yet for all these eerie alignments, the Malachi prophecies are shrouded in scholarly suspicion. The original manuscript didn't surface until the 16th century, leading many to believe it was an elaborate hoax by supporters of a particular cardinal. The Latin mottos are just ambiguous enough to allow creative reinterpretation, like reading shapes in clouds. De Meditate Luni, of the half-moon, assigned to Pope John I, could reference his brief 33-day papacy or his family name Luna, meaning moon in Italian. Critics argue it's classic cold reading, vague statements that only seem meaningful after events unfold. But here's where it gets thorny. Vatican archivists recently uncovered correspondence from the 1400s referencing Malachi's list, predating the alleged forgery by a century. And some mottos are too bizarrely specific to dismiss outright. Peregrinus Apostolicus, apostolic pilgrim, described Pope Pius VI, who died in exile as a prisoner of Napoleon. Flos Florum, flower of flowers, matched Pope Paul III's family crest bursting with lilies. Even if parts were fabricated, could someone have inserted accurate predictions into an existing framework? The darkest intrigue swirls around Malachi's finale. After Petrus Romanus, the text warns of a final pope presiding over Rome's destruction amid the seven-hilled city's devastation. Conspiracy theorists link this to everything from financial collapses to nuclear war, while traditionalists insist it merely signals a spiritual renewal. What no one disputes is this: if Malachi's vision holds, we're living through the last act. Whether divine foresight or medieval mischief, these prophecies have woven themselves into the Vatican's bones, a whispered countdown in Latin, ticking through the centuries toward an uncertain end. In the flickering candlelight of 16th century Provence, a former plague doctor dipped his quill into ink and began scribbling verses that would baffle the world for centuries. Nostradamus, the man whose name became synonymous with prophecy, penned nearly 1,000 cryptic quatrains in his Les Prophecies 4-line poems so densely packed with symbolism they've been interpreted as foreseeing everything from the Great Fire of London to the moon landing. But what separates genuine insight from desperate pattern seeking? The answer lies in understanding both his methods and the human tendency to retrofit meaning onto vague predictions. Take his most chillingly accurate vision, the rise of Adolf Hitler. Centuries before the Nazi regime, Nostradamus wrote of Hitler emerging from the forests of Germany, a leader who would cause the ruin of his own people. At first glance, the name seems an eerie misspelling of Hitler until you realize Hitler was a classical term for the Danube River. But here's where it gets uncanny. The quatrain also mentions childish blood poured on the ground, aligning with Hitler's youth programs and the Hitler Youth's indoctrination. Even more precise is the reference to the cross overturned, a possible nod to the Nazi suppression of Christianity. This isn't just wordplay, it's a pattern too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Yet for every hit, there are dozens of misses obscured by creative reinterpretation. Nostradamus enthusiasts often cite the great man struck down in the day by a thunderbolt as predicting John F. Kennedy's assassination, ignoring that the original French specifies the event would occur in a duel hardly matching Dealey Plaza. Similarly, the infamous 1999 seventh-month prediction of a great king of terror was widely feared as foreshadowing nuclear war, only for July 1999 to pass uneventfully. Later reinterpretations tried linking it to 9/11, but the date discrepancy and lack of contextual alignment reveal the dangers of forcing prophecies onto events. Nostradamus's true genius wasn't clairvoyance, it was cryptography. A trained astrologer, he blended Ptolemaic star charts with medieval symbolism, encoding predictions in layers of wordplay. His reference to the lion's head in a quatrain about the French Revolution wasn't just metaphorical. It correlated with the astrological sign Leo's position during Louis Roman XVI execution. Modern scholars analyzing his planetary alignments found that many quatrains mapped to specific celestial configurations, suggesting he wasn't seeing the future so much as calculating possible outcomes based on cyclical cosmic patterns. The real lesson of Nostradamus lies in how our brains crave narrative certainty. His verses thrive on what psychologists call the Gene Dixon effect, the tendency to remember hits and forget misses. A quatrain mentioning fire from the sky could apply to anything from volcanic eruptions to drone strikes, yet we spotlight the matches and ignore the hundreds of lines that never manifested. Even his infamous Antichrist predictions, often linked to Napoleon, Stalin, or modern dictators, rely on ambiguous phrasing that could fit any tyrant across history. But perhaps the most overlooked aspect of his work is its intentional obscurity. Persecuted by the Inquisition, Nostradamus buried his critiques of monarchy and religion in riddles to avoid censorship. When he wrote of the great empire falling to chaos, he may have been channeling contemporary fears about Renaissance Europe's instability rather than predicting World War II. His true gift wasn't prophecy, it was holding up a mirror to humanity's endless cycle of rise and ruin, wrapped in verses just elastic enough to let every generation see its own reflection. 5 centuries later, we're still deciphering his riddles, proving that the most enduring predictions aren't about events, but about the unshakable patterns of human nature. 25 prophecies, each a thread in the tapestry of human curiosity, weaving together fear, wisdom, and an insatiable desire to pierce the veil of time. From the trembling hands of Babylonian astronomers to the fevered quill of Nostradamus, these visions reveal something fundamental. We are creatures haunted by what comes next. But were these predictions genuine glimpses of destiny or simply the luck of hindsight? The answer, like the prophecies themselves, is layered. Consider the chilling precision of the Mayas, bearded men from the east, or the Byzantine scribe who foresaw Constantinople's fall down to the bleeding moon. These weren't vague musings, they were detailed, almost clinical in their accuracy. Yet for every prophecy that feels like a roadmap from the gods, there are dozens retrofitted to events after the fact. The Malachi papal prophecies, for instance, align suspiciously well, but only if you ignore the mismatches and stretch the Latin phrases to fit. Coincidence? Perhaps, but when multiple cultures separated by oceans and centuries describe similar events, floods, invasions, societal collapses, it begs the question, are we seeing patterns in the chaos, or is chaos itself predictable? The deeper truth may lie in how these prophecies shape the very future they foretell. The Oracle of Delphi's words didn't just predict Socrates' fate, they set it in motion. The Aztecs, convinced Cortés was Quetzalcoatl, handed him their empire on a silver platter. Prophecy, in this light, isn't passive, it's a catalyst bending human decisions to its will. Even today, climate scientists warn of ancient Zoroastrian predictions about mountains melting like wax, not because the sages were mystical, but because they understood the cycles of human neglect and renewal. So where does that leave us? If prophecies can be self-fulfilling, does that mean destiny is fixed, or do we cling to these visions because they offer the illusion of order in a random universe? The Hopi elders say the blue star Kachina's warning is a choice, not a sentence. The Norse believed Ragnarök would come, but also that a new world would rise from the ashes. Maybe prophecies aren't about inevitability, but accountability, a mirror held up to our best and worst impulses. Here's the question that lingers. If you'd lived in Socrates' Athens or Montezuma's Tenochtitlan, would you have heeded the warnings or dismissed them as madness? And more hauntingly, what prophecies are we ignoring today? The comment section is open. Tell us, have you ever encountered a prediction, ancient or personal, that came true in ways you couldn't explain? The future is lit.